So I'll end where I started. That there is a sort of a very generalized view of just some of the work. I could probably go on all night. There are many, many projects which I haven't shown, but I wanted to give a pretty broad cross-section of scales and typologies, and also methodologies that can be utilized, whether it's a tall tower, a tall skyscraper, or a low building. But just give you a flavor of the sort of investigations of skin, modification of climate that we're constantly being asked to investigate, and also to push. I think it's architects' responsibility to push our clients and raise the consciousness to make a difference. And on that, I will end, and thank you very much for listening.
We really do want to thank Brandon for the nice talk, and I loved at the beginning where he really tied it to the general issue of climate change. And I should mention that next Tuesday we're having a policy discussion here around climate change, and also on Wednesday there'll be a science-focused meeting on climate change, who Drew Shindell, who was featured in the New York Times Magazine, had helped me organize. So if the general issue of its interest, I just wanted to mention that. So we'll have a couple of minutes, I think, for a few questions before we move in for the reception. Are there any questions? We'll try to get microphones.
Yeah, the buildings in Europe seemed more innovative than the one in New York, and especially the one with what would you call it? The library.
Oh, yes.
And I was wondering if they're more open to innovation in Europe than here, or are there regulations that prevent innovation in this country?
I think the regulations are more stringent, yes. I think the imperative of governments to be involved and to push are more stringent, particularly in Germany. That's why I've always enjoyed the fact of, as Carol said earlier on, having worked, well, first of all, I lived and was educated here in the US when the original HSBC was being built. And I remember my education here. It was in the time of, how should I say it, postmodernism, the heydays of the 80s. And it had been interesting, having been educated in London at the Bartlett, and my friend Richard, who's here tonight, we were both at college together at the Bartlett all those years ago, and he went off to build the HSBC in Hong Kong, and I said, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to go to New York. And so we split in that sense. But being here, no one actually knew about the HSBC. No one was actually interested particularly in that form of technology, the lightness, the way, the more radical aspects of design. It was reduced here to very much a stylistic debate. So I think architecture is much more holistic than that. It's actually, we like to work with engineers, and it's much more about analysis, and the poetry comes out of that. But going back to your original question, I think the attitudes in Europe, and again starting in Germany, then looking at the UK, which is somewhere in between, say, Germany and America, in terms of its regulations and how early these countries started to catch on to the idea of sustainability, is an interesting sort of set of experiences. So you go from London and working on the Commerzbank, and then coming educated in the US, and then coming back to work on the Hearst building, and not understanding why one couldn't sort of start talking even about chilled ceilings in buildings, and the fact that no one wanted to have a raised floor, for example, for wiring. I mean, I remember saying we put raised floors in like we put glass in the windows. I mean, surely you're going to have a raised floor. So it's very interesting, the cultural and building differences across the continents. But having said all of that, I think it's changing very rapidly now here. and it's very gratifying to see. And if we can, in some small way, make a difference through the introduction of some of the things that we managed to achieve on the in the Hearst building, now others are following, and there will be more energy efficient buildings than the Hearst building in this city in the future, and that's fantastic.
One of the reasons Americans resist configurations like Commerzbank or the Moscow Tower that you just showed is they involve building so much more perimeter wall for the same amount of square feet, which of course is very costly but uses a lot of resources, and there are more elevator cores and stair towers. Is that a kind of calculation that you go through, what the kind of payback or how you evaluate that versus the advantages you get with a Commerzbank type of layout?
That's a very, very good question. I think there obviously is an increasing awareness and debate about the prime cost, if you like, of how much aluminum, how much more aluminum does it take to build a building at a primary energy source level. And I think we're beginning to move into the next era and period where perhaps the building materials themselves are analysed for their carbon footprint before you even use them. The use of sustainable timbers, for example, can be far more compelling. So I think over the next decade you're going to see a lot more interest in different materials and recycled materials, as opposed to using more, and I'll take the same example, aluminum to create more surface areas. Having said that, I think the long-term energy usage of a building is also important, and as I said, some projects are exemplars. I mean, if we're talking back in 94, mid-90s for the Commerzbank, it was the first green skyscraper. You've got Ken Yang now looking at his bio-skyscrapers. There aren't that many truly green skyscrapers that have been built. There's a lot on the drawing board now around the world. So, there is, again, a flywheel effect of the ideas and the realities, and I think it's a constantly evolving process.
I have a question. What can you say, with regards to first cost, because that always seems to be the first line of defense when you put a green project on the table?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question.
With regards to first cost.
Yeah.
When you put a green project on the table, the first thing the client says is this sustainability stuff is, above and beyond.
Too expensive.
Yeah, too expensive. What's your experience with that?
Well, I think there's a big difference between owner-occupier buildings. There's a big difference between institutional buildings and our developer community. Our developer community, and again, I find this very interesting in the economics of the whole game. The corporations and developers in the UK, through legislation, are having to make the buildings more sustainably efficient. The Part L regulations that are constantly changing and will become more stringent are a matter of law. So developers have to adhere to those, and architects have to perform, and engineers have to perform to achieve those regulations. So that's a legislative stick for developers. But I think also what is increasingly intriguing and interesting is the idea, and that's why I started talking about the sort of the iPod generation and the Prius, and the fact that as the consciousness gets raised in society at large, and the CEOs of Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers or you name it, HSBC, the corporations themselves are having their own green and sustainable manifestos. So you're Mr. Lehman Brothers or whatever, and you're looking for a new building to move into. Your own manifesto will dictate to a developer, I want to go into your building, but I want to make sure that it has sustainable attributes, because that is part of our corporate culture now. And that will be another form of stick for developers to start saying, yes, I want to make my building sustainable, because otherwise they'll lose out in the economy of their rival developers.
You mentioned that your firm considers 7 aspects of sustainable design when you're putting together a plan. Could you give a little more detail on what those 7 areas actually are?
Well, it would start with the site, brownfield site, regeneration. It will go on to the use of sustainable, renewable and recycled materials. It will look at building form and massing. You've really put me on the spot now, because I can, like, that's 4 or 3. But you know, the use of the materials, the sun shading, the systems in the building. I mean, it starts with the site and ends in the materials and the recycled and the aspect of the recycled materials and where they come from.
Maybe just one more question, and if you can just repeat the question, I think some folks in the back are having trouble hearing.
Okay.
Excuse me. There's only so many new skyscrapers that can go up in New York City and other cities that are already established. Is there any thought on Foster & Partners' part of applying your means to retrofitting existing buildings?
Yes, this is a question about, you know, would we use these for retrofitting? Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's very important to retrofit buildings. The Reichstag's a fantastic example. Indeed, you could argue the Hearst is an example of taking an old building and regenerating. That was a landmark that I like to say was a little bit of a tired landmark. I mean, it was little loved at the time. Slightly quirky building, and I think we've managed to reinvigorate and create a new landmark out of a landmark, so it's sort of a double landmark. The British Museum is another building that was retrofitted. The idea of retrofitting a lot of older skyscrapers is indeed happening quite a lot in London at the moment, taking old office buildings from the 60s that are no longer particularly useful for office space, floor-to-floor height's too low or whatever. They're just not good office space anymore. They don't attract the best rents. A lot of those are being converted into apartments. That's to do with conversion of typology, but I think at the same time you can convert those buildings and make them more energy efficient.